What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1 I call Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what action it is taking to tackle antisocial behaviour on public transport.
Minister Fiona Hislop.
Antisocial behaviour is clearly unacceptable on Scotland's public transport and in wider society, and we're committed to tackling it. The police, local authorities and other agencies are responsible for tackling antisocial behaviour at the local level, empowered by the Scottish Government to coordinate activities to tackle it. Formal warnings, fixed penalty notices, antisocial behaviour orders, alongside positive diversionary and early intervention activities can be used. Police Scotland and local authority antisocial behaviour teams support bus operators to enforce their conditions of carriage, and British Transport Police is responsible for law enforcement on Scotland's railway network.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Minister for that comprehensive reply. A number of constituents have raised concerns that the Young Persons Free Bus Travel Scheme is being abused by a small minority of young people who engage in antisocial behaviour on our bus network, thus deterring others from travelling. Have any offenders had their bus passes withdrawn, and what other actions have been taken specifically to reassure bus drivers and the overwhelming majority of passengers keen to travel by bus safely that harassment and intimidation will not be tolerated?
Minister.
The member raises important points, but it's important to remember that the vast majority of young people travelling by bus behave appropriately, with over 68 million journeys by the end of May. Now, free bus travel is just one of the services provided through the National Entitlement Card, and the card is also used to access a variety of national and local public services, such as free school meals and cashless catering. So as such, it's not appropriate for transport operators to remove cards from car holders due to the impact that that might have on other services. But the Scottish Government does recognise there isn't a single approach to tackle antisocial behaviour, and there are a whole suite of enforcement measures I've just mentioned and safe intervention. But it's important to work with partners on this, and only yesterday at the Bus Task Force I heard from different partners of how they've tackled this issue at Kilmarnock Bus Station.
Thank you. Question number 2, Clare Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and apologies for missing the start of questions today. To ask the Scottish Government how it is supporting people in Motherwell and Wishaw constituency to access mental health support.
Minister Marie Todd.
Over the past year, we've provided over £700,000 to support 25 grassroots community mental health projects for adults in Motherwell and Wishaw. We're also providing North Lanarkshire Council with over £900,000 this year to fund community-based mental health supports for children, young people and their families. We're working with NHS Lanarkshire to plan for long-term sustainable improvements to CAMHS, offering tailored support to improve delivery of CAMHS and psychological therapies. Finally, I'm sure that Clare, Adamson and others in the Chamber will welcome today's publication of our mental health and wellbeing strategy, which will set out our vision for improving mental health, building on ongoing work in Lanarkshire and across Scotland.
Clare Adamson.
I thank the Minister for her answer. The Scottish Government Distress Brief Intervention Programme was launched in 2016 and piloted in 4 health board areas, including Lanarkshire. Distress Brief Intervention is a non-clinical intervention that provides quick, connected and compassionate support to people experiencing distress. Can I ask the Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has undertaken of the impact of the pilot programmes, what plans there are to scale up distress brief intervention and what actions it will take to promote this service to people in my constituency, particularly through primary care?
Minister.
I thank the member for that question. It's a very good point. The Distress Brief Intervention Programme, the DBI programme, supported over 43,000 people since it was launched in 4 pilot areas in 2017. DBI is designed to support people who are in emotional distress, who come into contact with emergency services. And in addition, NHS boards can enable GPs to refer directly into the service. 2 independent evaluations have shown it to be highly effective in providing people with timely, compassionate help, connecting them into local services that can help them to manage their distress and address the issues that might be causing it. So DBI is now offered widely across Scotland, as well as through NHS 24 and police and ambulance call handling centres. And I'm very pleased to say that we're well on track to meet our target of making DBI available in all NHS boards by March 24. Very happy to work with the member on ways to highlight the excellent service in her local constituency, because the pilot work that they did was so helpful to us in developing this excellent service.
Thank you. Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recently held an event with the Miracle Foundation in Parliament to raise awareness of the incredible work that they do to support children and young people with bereavement and trauma. They advised MSPs in attendance that support services are proving extremely hard to access for families in the Motherwell area due to high costs associated with private counselling and therapy services and waiting times of over 24 months for NHS and CAMHS services. Despite the pilot programme, latest figures show that almost 1,600 children and young people are currently on a CAMHS waiting list in Lanarkshire. So can I ask the Minister, with charities and third-party organisations stretched, what strategy has the Government put in place to tackle mental health backlogs for children and young people in Motherwell and across Lanarkshire that involve these vital organisations?
Minister.
So the member will be aware of all of the work that's going on to tackle the CAMHS waiting list. And of course, one of the focuses of that is to ensure that we tackle the long waits as well as the new people coming into the system. And we're seeing, as I've said before in the Chamber, real progress on that front. But as well as improving the CAMHS waiting times, we have done a lot of work to increase resources in the community, and all children will have access to a school counsellor. Last year, in the first 6 months of the year, that meant that 15,000 children and young people were able to access support through their school. And I talked about the community funding that we're providing, over £900,000. As I mentioned in my answer to Clare Adamson, around 45,000 children and families around Scotland were able to access support through that funding in the second half of last year.
Thank you. Question number 3 is not lodged. Question number 4, Kevin Stewart.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to mitigate the impact of the cost of living crisis on people across Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
We have allocated almost £3 billion in 23-24 to support policies which tackle poverty and to protect people as far as possible from the harm inflicted by UK Government policies and the cost of living crisis. We are supporting households by tripling our fuel insecurity fund to £30 million and delivering the game-changing Scottish Child Payment. We are also providing free childcare to all 3- and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds, free bus travel for over 2 million people and offering free school meals to all pupils in primaries 1 to 5 and in special schools.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer, and I welcome the Scottish Government's efforts to mitigate Tory austerity and the Tory cost of living crisis. But can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what discussion have ministers had with the UK Government about the increase in interest rates and the impact that that's having on mortgages and households throughout Scotland and indeed the UK as a whole?
Cabinet Secretary.
Households are struggling with the increasingly unaffordable cost of food, housing and bills after years of austerity, a hard Brexit and economic mismanagement at the hands of the Conservative Government. The Chancellor is also failing in his target to bring down inflation, and households are facing the impact of high interest rates. Oversight and regulation of mortgage lenders is a reserved matter, and the Scottish Government has repeatedly asked the UK Government to do more to help those impacted. Having a UK social security system which is actually based on what people need for an adequate standard of living would be but one example of what the UK Government could deliver right now to help people right across the country, and it is deeply regrettable that they choose not to do so.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister may be aware of research from Marie Curie and Loughborough University's Centre for Research and Social Policy, which shows the profound impact and difficult choices facing those living with the double burden of rising costs associated with terminal illness and the reduction in their ability to work, which is brought about by their terminal illness. These people are in a truly desperate situation, so how will the Government mitigate the impact of the cost of living crisis on those facing dying, death and bereavement?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, one of the examples that I can give is the improved social security system that we have here for those who have a terminal illness, and the more dignified approach that we have to dealing with applications that come into Social Security Scotland. And I think that does show that there is support that we can and indeed are giving to those at the most difficult of times.
Thank you. Question number 5, Daniel Johnson.
You asked the Scottish Government what post-diagnostic clinical support is available for autistic children and young people.
Minister Marie Todd.
Thank you. We continue to invest in neurodevelopmental services to ensure support for children and young people meets the standards and availability of services set out in the National Neurodevelopmental Specification for Children and Young People. The specification makes clear that support should be put in place to meet the child or young person's requirements when they need it, rather than be dependent on a formal diagnosis. In 22-23, we allocated £46 million via the Mental Health Outcomes Framework to improve the quality and delivery of mental health services for all, including neurodevelopmental services. We also fund a range of supports in school, including the Autism Toolbox, as well as materials and training events that support inclusive approaches by practitioners across Scotland.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the Minister for that answer and remind the Chamber of my own diagnosis of ADHD. So the Scottish Government has now completed its National Autism Post-Diagnostic Support, which included families, children and young people. But I am hearing concerning reports that it is not the Government's intention to continue that funding for families, children or young people, which compounds the very real sense that people feel is that there's a cliff edge represented by a diagnosis, in that people wait for years to get an assessment, and yet there is nothing there once they have that diagnosis of autism. So can the Minister confirm whether the Scottish Government is planning to cut this funding? And if so, what support will there be for people once they have that diagnosis of autism?
Minister.
So funding for the pilot was provided for a 3-year period that came to an end in March of this year. The £1 million support fund for post-diagnostic support will be directed at adults who currently receive very little local funding. And as I've set out already in my answer, we're already providing significant additional funding to support autistic children and young people. There's always learning from pilots, which we can build into wider services and support. And I'm very grateful to the National Autistic Society and Autism Scotland for work that they have taken forward. And I expect to confirm soon that we will continue to fund Scottish Autism to provide their advice line for parents and carers.
I'm going to call for concise questions and responses. I call Stephanie Callaghan.
It is essential, Presiding Officer, that the Scottish Government engages with people with lived experience, including autistic people and their families, and keeps person-centred approaches at the very heart of this work. So with that in mind, what action has the Scottish Government taken to ensure a range of voices continue to be involved in the planning, decision-making and the delivery of neurodevelopmental pathways?
Minister.
We have a number of opportunities for people with lived experience to get involved and actually work very closely with charities that are led by people with autism. We are working at the moment, as you know, on developing a bill which I hope will be very powerful in upholding their human rights, and we are engaging a great deal with people with lived experience. If the member is aware of people who would like to contribute to that work, I'd be more than happy to hear from her.
Thank you. Question number 6, Colin Smith.
Thank you, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to invest in the opening of any new railway stations in Dumfries and Galloway.
Minister Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government is committed to improving connectivity in the south-west of Scotland, and the second Strategic Transport Projects Review has recommended improvements to the railways in the region, which include decarbonisation of passenger services, improved freight capability and moving Stranraer Station. At the moment, the Scottish Government do not have any plans to invest in the opening of any new railway lines on existing new railway stations on existing lines, and the case for investment for new or reopened stations driven locally or regionally continue to be considered by the Government as they are brought forward.
Colin Smith.
I thank the Minister for confirming the answer being none. I mean, after years of hard work and tens of thousands spent developing cases to reopen Eastriggs, Thornhill, BTIC Station, encouraged all the way by Transport Scotland, officials there have just confirmed there was never any chance these stations would meet the Government's criteria. And to add insult to injury, the same officials say bus-based options are available, utterly oblivious to the fact the bus network in Dumfries and Galloway is collapsing before our eyes. So can I urge the Minister in her new role to look at the reasons why her Government and Transport Agency are failing to invest properly in the transport infrastructure in Dumfries and Galloway, causing untold economic damage, because frankly we're tired of being Scotland's forgotten region.
Minister.
I appreciate the member's concerns, and there are a number of regional investments taking place in that particular region. But can I say that 7% real terms capital reductions in our budget over the next period, driven by economic mismanagement by the UK Government, is not helping the situation. You'll know about Sestrans' own transport appraisal reports. Their own transport appraisal reports said that BTIC, Eastriggs and Thornhill are unlikely to stack up from an economic perspective, and the benefit-cost ratios for BTIC and Eastriggs and poor for Thornhill Station. So that's from the local transport authority, but I think we should always be looking at potential integrated mode transport resolution, and I do commit in my new capacity to work with members across the south-west of Scotland.
Moving on to question 7, we must have concise questions and responses. Stewart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, when it last spoke to the SFA about its efforts to make elite men's football in Scotland as accessible as possible to everyone, specifically children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Minister
Marie Todd.
The Scottish Government meets with the Scottish FA frequently to discuss a wide range of issues, including the accessibility of the game.
Stewart McMillan.
Thank the Minister for that brief reply. The Minister will be aware of the 2 recent Scotland men's games televised on Viaplay, which is a monthly subscription service, in addition to the Scotland men's home shirt for juniors costing £50 and also for adults £70. Can the Minister therefore outline what discussions the Scottish Government have had with the SFA about televising our national men's game, again free or on free-to-air television, so that everyone across Scotland can actually have access and also show their support?
Minister.
Unfortunately, neither the Scottish Government nor the Scottish FA play a role in the selling of match rights for the Euro 24 qualifiers. It's a centralised process run by UEFA. We believe that men's and women's Scottish international football matches should be part of the crown jewels of free-to-air sporting events, but sadly, the UK Government have absolutely failed to act on this matter. We'll continue to press the UK Government to expand the listed events regime, and we'll continue to work with the Scottish FA to continue to make football more accessible to everyone across society.
Question number 8, Mark Ruskell.
to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the pilot providing free bus travel to people seeking asylum in Glasgow.
Minister Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government funded pilot led by the Refugee Survival Trust and partners in Glasgow commenced on Monday the 30th of January and will run until July. It provides travel support to people seeking asylum living in Glasgow through the provision of a 12-week digital pass along with information and digital support. Participants will provide information on how often they travel by bus, the reasons for their journeys and how having access to bus travel impacts their lives. The findings collected will help inform longer-term solutions to provide free bus travel to people seeking asylum in Scotland.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Minister for that response and warmly welcome her to her new role in government. I look forward to working with her in the months and years ahead. Now, the pilot in Glasgow will show us exactly how life-changing free travel could be for people seeking asylum, who, thanks to Tory hostility, are forced to live on barely £45 a week. But we've already got similar stories from schemes in Aberdeen and Wales making the case for change. So will the Minister agree to meet with campaigners to discuss next steps on extending the scheme to all those who are seeking asylum in Scotland?
Minister.
Yes, I will be happy to meet representatives of these groups following the conclusion of the pilot to discuss how free bus travel can best be provided to people to help support them in what are really challenging circumstances. They are in a difficult position. They're not generally allowed to work to support themselves, or are they eligible for benefits? And the Scottish Government takes an inclusive approach to people seeking asylum, working to enable access to support and services on the same basis as other Scottish residents, where that is possible.
Call Co-Cap Stewart for a brief supplementary.
Thank you. The Minister will be aware that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee has undertaken an inquiry on the experience of asylum seekers here in Scotland, and with severely limited financial support, it's clear that free bus travel will better enable access to services. Can the Minister outline what discussions have been had with the UK Government about providing wider support to asylum seekers accessing transport services?
Brief response, please, Minister.
So the Ending Destitution Together strategy, in that the Scottish Government recommends to the UK Government they should ensure that the financial element of asylum support should reflect the real costs of daily life, including travel. I'm limited for time, President Officer, so I will just reiterate that the Scottish Ministers continue to raise issues which impact people seeking asylum living in our communities and push the United Kingdom Government for positive change.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions. At question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. At the weekend, SNP members met in Dundee to have an independence conference. During Hamza Yousaf's speech, a brave woman spoke out. Theresa Mallet protested on behalf of herself and a group of more than 100 other patients of the disgraced surgeon Sam El-Jamel. Dr El-Jamel left NHS Tayside patients who came for help scarred, broken and devastated. Theresa wants answers. She is demanding a public inquiry. But when Hamza Yousaf was Health Secretary, he refused to grant one. So can he tell Theresa and all of the victims of Dr El-Jamel why he refused to grant that public inquiry?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I have agreed to meet with Ms Mallet and I'm due to meet with her, I believe, early next week. And of course, when I was Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, I also met a number of other victims of Professor El-Jamel. And let me start this answer by reiterating just how much sympathy I have for the trauma that they have undoubtedly suffered at the hands of Professor El-Jamel. Let me also put on record that a number of MSPs from across the backbenches have raised issues on behalf of their constituents who again have been traumatised by the disgraceful actions of Professor El-Jamel, including his own backbench colleague Liz Smith as well. What I would say to Douglas Ross is that as First Minister, indeed Michael Matheson as Cabinet Secretary for Health, we will continue to not just engage with all of those who have been affected by Professor El-Jamel's disgraceful actions. What we'll seek to do is get the answers that they want. And that goes to the heart of why a public inquiry hasn't been completely ruled off the table. The reason why we haven't committed to a public inquiry on the issue of Professor El-Jamel's actions is twofold. First and foremost, we all know in this chamber that a public inquiry can take some years, rightly so, understandably so. And therefore, is there a way of getting the answers that the victims Professor El-Jamel want? Can we get that sooner? Can we get it quicker, as opposed to often the years and years it can take for a public inquiry? That's the first reason why we haven't instructed a public inquiry. The second reason, of course, is that Professor El-Jamel is not in this country. He is practising, I believe, as a doctor elsewhere overseas abroad. The likelihood of Professor El-Jamel, I think, cooperating with any public inquiry is very, very low, and therefore would a public inquiry be able to get the answers that the victims like Miss Mallet and others are seeking. So I will end where I started, which is a public inquiry hasn't been ruled completely off the table, but what we're seeking to do with all the victims of El-Jamel is, can we get them the answers that they deserve in a way that is quicker and more expeditious than going through a public inquiry.
Douglas Ross.
So if I can take the 2 points that the First Minister has mentioned. First of all, the pace of a public inquiry. Surely the quicker it is actioned and starts, the quicker we can start to get answers for victims like Teresa and so many others. And secondly, we shouldn't be letting Dr El-Jamel off by assuming that he will not respond or cooperate. He is a key part of this, but there are others at NHS Tayside and the victims that we need to hear from. Because Ms Mallet told the First Minister on Saturday that she wants people responsible to be under oath, so victims might finally get answers that I think the First Minister and I both agree they deserve. The First Minister also mentioned the cross-party support that have actioned this with the current Health Secretary. They met with Michael Matheson in April. He promised an update by the end of May. We're now at the end of June, and my colleague Liz Smith has written to him twice in the last week seeking that update. This morning he responded to say he is currently too busy to meet with the cross-party group, but will look to do so in the coming weeks. But surely, given these allegations came to light more than a decade ago, we cannot wait any longer. So can the First Minister ensure that his Health Secretary responds to all MSPs who are concerned about this immediately?
First Minister.
Well, as Douglas Ross referenced in his question, Michael Matheson has obviously engaged with cross-party MSPs. I have engaged, and indeed Health Secretaries before me have engaged in this issue, not just with cross-party MSPs, but with the victims of Professor El-Jamel. And it would also be fair to say that a range of actions have been taken to try to learn the lessons from what has happened in this traumatic and tragic case, and to hopefully prevent another case like this happening. But it should be made clear that the responsibility for the actions of El-Jamel sit with Professor El-Jamel himself, a disgraced surgeon, and therefore it is right, of course, that NHS Tayside does look to learn lessons, but I don't think we should ever, and I know Douglas Ross is not doing this, ever look to abdicate El-Jamel of the actions that he was responsible for. Douglas Ross will undoubtedly be aware that a review was commissioned by the Scottish Government, including detailed reviews of the care received by a couple of victims of El-Jamel who have spoken out very publicly, and I applaud them for doing so, Mr Kelly and Miss Rose. And that was undertaken by 2 independent consultant neurosurgeons, and the recommendations of those actions have been accepted by NHS Tayside. The reason why I mention that review is that there may be, again, an option short of a public inquiry that will allow an independent review into cases to look and to explore what more can be done, what could be learnt from what is a tragic episode for all of those who have been affected. In terms of Douglas Ross's direct question, of course, Michael Matheson absolutely will respond. I know this is the last, of course, FMQs of the session, but we are going to continue, of course, all of us, I suspect, work right throughout the course of the summer. So I would expect Michael Matheson, he will, of course, make himself available where he can to continue to engage, not just with cross-party MSPs, but also with the victims of Professor El-Jamel.
It is indeed the last FMQs of the session. I have many members who are keen to put questions to the First Minister today. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I stress again, this is an issue that Scottish Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrat and SNP members met with the Health Secretary about in April, were promised an update in May, have been told this morning it will now be several more weeks. There is an urgency here, and I hope the Health Secretary and the First Minister can agree to update the concerned members today. Give them that update today before we leave for the summer recess, and then there can be further updates through the summer, because there are so many unanswered questions here, Presiding Officer. The First Minister mentioned 2 victims and said NHS Tayside had accepted the outcome of the independent review of their cases, but the victims haven't. One of the patients, Jules Rose, who the First Minister mentioned, says, I have still not got answers 2 years on from the independent review of my case commissioned by the Scottish Government. So how can I be reassured that the new independent review will help patients? That's what they're saying about the current process being suggested by the First Minister. Now, a Freedom of Information request published by the Scottish Government this morning contains minutes of a meeting held between NHS Tayside and Dr El Jamel on the 3rd of June 2013. During that meeting, Dr El Jamel seems to have got off practically scot-free. Junior doctors are blamed in this for mistakes made by Dr El Jamel, and the Health Board seems to accept his heartless promise to, and I quote, maintain the quality of his service. That is just scandalous. So when he was Health Secretary, did Hamza Yousaf demand to know from NHS Tayside what they knew and when they knew it?
First Minister.
Yes, I had a range of conversations with NHS Tayside, including with the Chief Executive and the Chair, on this issue of Professor El Jamel. Of course, Douglas Ross will be well aware, and I'm happy to ensure that he gets a written update in this regard of the actions that were taken forward by NHS Tayside. I am not standing here. I suspect, in fact, I know that the Chair and the Chief Executive of NHS Tayside would not say that there were not lessons to be learnt from the tragic case that has affected so many victims, including Miss Rose and Mr Kelly, 2 patients who I have met and that we will continue to engage with. In terms of the specific issues around engagement with patients, there is there has been an established process for former patients of Professor El Jamel to contact NHS Tayside, and there is also an independent mediator that's been appointed to work with NHS Tayside and 2 former patients whose experiences were reviewed by the Scottish Government and 2 independent consultant neurosurgeons. So that engagement with patients absolutely will continue. As I say, there are some outstanding questions that I know patients want answered. I do believe that we can work with NHS Tayside to try to get those answers. There is a request being made by a number of MSPs, by Douglas Ross, for a public inquiry. It's not ruled off the table, not taken off the table, but I do think that there may be other ways to get the answers that Miss Mallet, Mr Kelly, Miss Rose and many other victims of El Jamel absolutely deserve.
Douglas Ross.
The Freedom of Information request that was published this morning by the Scottish Government also shows that complaints were mounting from victims, but in many cases were dismissed. Complaints were growing as well from NHS Tayside staff, who appear to have originally raised the alarm back in 2009. But healthcare professionals say they were warned not to speak out. One whistleblower said, I did raise concerns at the time, but I was shut down. It went all the way to the board. They knew about it. The First Minister is saying that a public inquiry is not off the table, but he needs to be clearer. He needs to say it is on the table, it is going to happen. The actions of Dr El Jamel ruined people's lives, but the actions of the Health Board suggest a cover-up at the highest level. First Minister, doesn't this simply demand a full public inquiry?
First Minister.
So again, I would take the points that Douglas Ross raises in turn. In terms of the whistleblowing processes in 2009, I think by any objective observation, there has been improvements in terms of the whistleblowing processes. I've met myself, when I was Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, with whistleblowing champions in our territorial health boards. There have been improvements in the whistleblowing process since 2009, since that particular statement was made by the member of staff. My predecessor, when stood here, did often say, and I will reiterate this point, that whistleblowers can, of course, and should go through the appropriate whistleblowing route, but if they ever want to contact the government directly about concerns that they have, they can absolutely do that too. We take issues of whistleblowing extremely seriously, indeed, regardless of which health board is affected. So again, I will really end where I started in terms of the questioning from Douglas Ross. This is an incredibly serious issue. It's an issue where individuals have been left utterly traumatised. We will work with those individuals, those victims, those survivors, in order to try to get them the answers they absolutely deserve. And of course, a public inquiry is not ruled off the table, but let's look at how we can get them the answers they deserve as quickly as we possibly can.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, this week the UK COVID inquiry has started to take evidence from Scottish Government witnesses. It is the first we are hearing from the Scottish Government in any public inquiry about their response to the COVID pandemic. 3 years on from the start of the pandemic, bereaved families are still waiting for answers. But here in Scotland, families are going to have to wait even longer, because last year the chair of the Scottish COVID inquiry and its legal team walked out. And we still have little idea of when the inquiry will begin questioning ministers and officials, let alone when it will conclude. So, First Minister, will grieving families get the answers they deserve by the end of this Parliament?
First Minister.
I can thank Anna Sarwar for raising what is an incredibly important issue indeed, and he will be looking at and observing the UK COVID inquiry, for which, of course, there are a number of Scottish witnesses in front of the UK inquiry today. Anna Sarwar, as an experienced member of this Parliament, of course, will know that it would be inappropriate for me as the First Minister, deeply inappropriate for me as the First Minister, to interfere or intervene in what is an independent public inquiry. Of course, we want the COVID inquiry to be delivered at speed, but what I will say to Anna Sarwar is, having met the bereaved families myself, I can completely understand why they want that COVID inquiry to move, the Scottish COVID inquiry, to move at pace. It's so important that the COVID inquiry takes the necessary steps. It has to get those answers in a transparent way and manner. And the final thing I'll say to Anna Sarwar, and which I'm happy to repeat time and time again, whatever we can do to cooperate with the inquiry from the Scottish Government, we absolutely will.
Anna Sarwar.
I hear what the First Minister said, but this is important for thousands of families who have lost a loved one, to NHS and care staff, and everyone across Scotland who will be frustrated by the Scottish inquiry running behind, because we must learn the lessons of the pandemic. But the inquiry's conclusions will only be as good as the evidence it receives. Over the past few weeks, people have been horrified by the UK Government's decision to withhold evidence from the UK inquiry. In Scotland, the Scottish inquiry team issued do not destroy letters to public bodies, including the Scottish Government, last August. It made clear that all documents, including emails, texts or WhatsApp messages, should be retained, and that any destruction of these messages is a criminal offence. So can the First Minister confirm that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the do not destroy instruction, and will he give a guarantee that all requested emails, texts or WhatsApp messages will be handed over in full to the inquiry?
First Minister.
Yes, they will. And of course it is important that I abide by the rules of both the UK public inquiry and the Scottish public inquiry. Section 17 of the Inquiries Act 2005 gives the chair alone the responsibility to decide how an inquiry should operate. It's therefore a matter for the independent inquiry chairs to make decisions as to what material they request from the Scottish Government or indeed from other participants. Both inquiries have taken the decision, again, the independent decision, not a decision that I interfere in whatsoever, but both inquiries have taken the decision not to publish details of the requests they are making to participants. But all participants, including the Scottish Government, have been asked by the inquiry not to share the content of requests that they receive. And so, of course, the Scottish Government will comply with the request. But to ensure there is simply no doubt whatsoever, any material that is asked for, WhatsApp messages, emails, Signal, Telegram, whatever is asked for or requested, will absolutely be handed over to the COVID inquiries and handed over to them in full.
Anna Sarwar.
So this is really significant. So to confirm, the First Minister has told us that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy instruction, and that all ministers and officials, past and present, will hand over all evidence in full without omission and evasion. As I say, a really significant intervention from the First Minister. Because COVID took a heavy toll on everyone across this country, and we continue to feel its impact. The least we can expect is that when grieving families come looking for answers, this SNP government provides them. Because we know, sadly, that this is a government famed for a culture of secrecy and cover-up. Last week, Dr Lisa Mitchell KC, the lawyer for the bereaved families across Scotland, said this at the UK COVID inquiry: no person, no institution, no matter how powerful, whether it be in England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, Westminster, Holyrood, can obstruct the search for truth. So will the First Minister commit to writing to me and other members of this Parliament outlining what steps the Scottish Government has taken to ensure that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy order, and how this data is being retained and how it will be handed over to the inquiry?
First Minister.
Well, I think that question from Anna Sarwar is because he didn't expect me to, of course, say that I would fully comply with the COVID public inquiry. So he was not able to adapt his second question as a result of the answer. So I'm happy to reiterate what I've already said to Anna Sarwar. This is a really important issue, so they may not want to heckle this point. I think it's really important for me to absolutely reiterate that we have, of course, and have had a long-standing policy on retention of documents, and not just documents, in fact, as per email or written correspondence, but including social media messages. So I'm more than happy for that guidance to be shared. I'm more than happy to write to Anna Sarwar or any other member who has an interest around how we comply with those various guidelines that are very much in place. What I would also say to Anna Sarwar is this is absolutely about the bereaved families. That's why the Government has met with the families who have been bereaved by COVID. We will cooperate fully with that inquiry. Anna Sarwar suggests that we are not transparent. I would remind him it is this Government who instructed that public inquiry. And I would also remind Anna Sarwar, in fact, it was my predecessor who stood up every single day during that pandemic to face questions from the press in order to communicate as openly and transparently as possible. So we are transparent as a government. We'll continue to be transparent.
First Minister, if I could stop you there, could we please stop having conversations across the aisles? It makes it very difficult to hear. First Minister.
And we will continue to cooperate fully with both public inquiries.
Thank you. Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet.
First Minister.
We'll be meeting a few times throughout the course of the summer recess.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for that reply. Reinforced, autoclaved, aerated concrete is a light and bubbly material that was used in public sector construction for decades. Think of the inside of an aero bar and you get the idea. But in February, NHS Scotland issued a safety action notice. It warned that roofs, walls and flooring made of this material are, and I quote, at risk of catastrophic structural failure, which could occur suddenly and without warning. A school roof has already collapsed in Kent. Now, Liberal Democrat research published in The Times has established that this concrete has so far been found by at least 4 Scottish health boards and in 37 schools up and down our country. It's above patients and it's above pupils. I am not trying to frighten people here, but we do need to identify the buildings at risk and fix them. That could cost tens or hundreds of millions of pounds. So will the First Minister establish a national fund to help hard-up health boards and councils make these buildings safe?
First Minister.
I appreciate and thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for raising an important issue around aerated concrete. What I would say to Alex Cole-Hamilton before discussions on any fund that may or may not be necessary is really important, as Alex Cole-Hamilton alludes to in his question, that we understand the scale and the scope of the problem and the challenge that we're facing. And therefore, I'm happy to write to Alex Cole-Hamilton with more detail, but I'll give him one example in relation to health boards. NHS Assure are already conducting a review into this issue, quite an intrusive review actually, to understand the nature of what we're dealing with and the scope of what we are dealing with. So Alex Cole-Hamilton is absolutely right to raise a very important issue. I will give consideration to the matter he raises around a fund, but before doing so, what I would say to Alex Cole-Hamilton, it's really important, imperative in fact, vital that we understand the scope and the nature of what we're dealing with, and thereafter I'm happy to give consideration to Alex Cole-Hamilton's suggestion. I will write to Alex Cole-Hamilton with details of the reviews that we're conducting in buildings that we are responsible for.
Question number 4, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to help raise awareness of the importance of stem cell donation in the treatment of blood cancer and blood disorders.
First Minister.
Thank Bill Kidd for raising this important issue. I fully agree that increasing awareness of the importance of stem cell donations is absolutely vital, especially in those where more donors are needed to sign up, including men and those from BAME communities as well. I myself have been in the register for stem cell donors for nearly 2 decades. The Scottish Government recognises the importance of stem cell donations and continues to promote it alongside key partners like Anthony Nolan through a number of initiatives. We have included information on our Organ Donation Scotland website, which provides the public with information on how they can register as a stem cell donor, and I would encourage everybody to look at that website and to register. Last year, we also launched our updated school resource to educate children and young people about organ donation, about organ tissue and stem cell donation. Nationally, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and Police Scotland have partnered with Anthony Nolan to promote stem cell donation and encourage staff, young people and school pupils to register as a potential donor. Lastly, our new cancer strategy, which will work towards improving cancer survival and providing excellent, equitable access to care.
Bill Kidd.
Thank the First Minister for that reply and join him in welcoming the partnerships which take place with the Anthony Nolan Trust. And I note that he mentioned the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Will he also join me in congratulating the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on receiving the Shirley Nolan Special Recognition Award for its efforts to raise awareness and inspire others to sign up to the stem cell register for the Anthony Nolan Trust?
First Minister.
I absolutely will. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service deserve every bit of credit for the excellent partnership work that they do with the Anthony Nolan Trust. I absolutely echo Bill Kidd's words and once again congratulate the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on their well-deserved award. I think I should also, Presiding Officer, take the opportunity to recognise the tireless work of Bill Kidd in highlighting the importance of stem cell donation, and that was rightly recognised, in fact, by the awards. He was rightly recognised as Political Supporter of the Year at Anthony Nolan Support Awards, and very well deserved indeed.
Question number 5, Jackson Carlow.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the recommendations in the report Transvaginal Mesh Case Record Review by Professor Alison Britton.
First Minister.
Well, can I first put on record my thanks to Jackson Carlow and others, but I think it's important to recognise Jackson Carlow's tireless efforts in standing up for and advocating on behalf of those women who have suffered as a result of transvaginal mesh implants. I am grateful to Professor Britton and her team for undertaking what I think, I don't doubt for a minute, is a very thorough and insightful piece of work. I would express my thanks to the patients who took part in the review. I sincerely hope that they found it beneficial. And I don't need to say to Jackson Carlow or anybody else in this chamber how traumatic and re-traumatising it can be for those survivors to continue to tell their story. We have taken many steps already that address a number of Professor Britton's findings. We've introduced new training for GPs about mesh, we've improved information for patients about the specialist mesh removal service in Glasgow, and the Chief Medical Officer continues to champion shared decision-making through his Realistic Medicine initiative. However, we will, of course, now study the report in great detail and consider what further steps have to be taken.
Jackson Carlo.
Well, can I thank the First Minister for that and for his engagement with the issue? And I wonder if he would commit, when the Government has responded in full to the report, to a full chamber debate in the autumn for us to consider it. But can I ask him to react to the observation by Professor Britton in the introduction and overview to this report, where she comments on a parallel report she was invited to undertake by the now Deputy First Minister in 2017 and which was published in 2018. And she says this: the report highlighted a number of failings and made recommendations on how independent reviews should be conducted in the future. Despite being well received, to date none of the 46 recommendations have been implemented by the Scottish Government. Now, he's referred to the work that colleagues across the chamber have done over the last decade with these women. Does he understand their dismay and frustration that none of 46 recommendations made 5 years ago have been implemented? And can I ask him, what will he do to rectify that?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm very happy for the Government to commit to bring a debate forward to this chamber in order to discuss and engage again in this important issue once we are ready to respond to the latest review. In terms of the 2018 investigative review, we did accept and agreed with the vast majority of Professor Britton's conclusions, and those recommendations have actually already been reflected in a number of inquiries and reviews that have been established in recent years. We're also developing guidance to support inquiries and reviews that will very much build upon Professor Britton's recommendations and hope to publish that shortly. And I'm happy to communicate with both Jackson Carlo and, of course, with Professor Britton directly to give Jackson Carlo and her and anybody else who has some concerns around those recommendations. But I can give an absolute commitment that not only have we agreed, but a number of those commitments, those recommendations, forgive me, have been already implemented in reviews that we have taken forward.
Take a brief supplementary from Stewart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be very much aware of my support for a number of my constituents who have suffered the horrors of transvaginal mesh implants. And the women have my unwavering support in their efforts to firstly have the mesh removed and secondly seek answers as to why the NHS services have often seemed to work against them instead of for them. Now, notwithstanding obviously what the First Minister has said today, can I ask the First Minister to ensure that the report is considered and responded to as soon as possible, given the continued difficulties many women in my constituency across Scotland are facing at present, but also because of the lack of trust many women actually have had in the NHS, particularly with regards to mesh services.
First Minister.
Can I thank Stewart McMillan and again recognise the tireless advocacy that he has done on behalf of constituents who have been affected by the implantation of transvaginal mesh. I think for me it's incredibly important to reiterate that I pay tribute to the women who have come forward bravely over the years to tell their story, because Stewart McMillan is absolutely right. Many of them have used words like gaslight. They have not been believed, that they don't have trust in the authorities, in the NHS, in the various processes that we have brought forward. So it's so important that everything we do, we bear in mind that lesson, that we ensure that we give the survivors in these cases trust in the processes that we're bringing forward. And I've met many women, some of them constituents of mine, others right across the country, who have suffered as a result of transvaginal mesh being implanted. So we will respond, as Stewart McMillan asks, we will respond as soon as we possibly can. And as I've said in my response to Jackson Carlo, I think it would be a good idea that he suggests of bringing a debate to this Parliament so we can have a full and frank discussion and debate about it.
Jackie Bailey, brief supplementary, please.
The review also recommends that all information on MESH is drawn into a single website to keep patients informed. Will the First Minister commit today to publishing waiting times on the website to inform patients about how long it will take to get their treatment, given that some are being forced to wait as long as 448 days? Will he take action to end these unacceptable waiting times as a matter of urgency?
First Minister, concisely.
Well, I'm more than happy to look at what more we can do to be transparent as we are around waiting times. When I look at, for example, the Glasgow mesh service, there's simply no doubt that that has been affected because of the pandemic, and surgery was paused for a time due to particularly COVID and winter pressures. However, I was looking at the Glasgow mesh service latest data on surgeries since they have been restarted. That service will soon be able to operate within 12 weeks of the patient and their clinician deciding upon the course of treatment. So we are making progress around some of the treatments that are available, but I will look into the issue around transparency around waiting times and report back to the member.
Thank you. Question number 6, Monica Lennon.
To ask the First Minister whether he can provide an update on the Scottish Government's commitment to roll out universal free school meals amid concerns that there will be further delays to the expansion of universal free school meal provision for primary 6 and 7s, and that no progress has been made on the Scottish Government's commitment to establish a secondary school pilot scheme.
First Minister.
Well, can I say I'm very proud of the progress that the SNP-led Scottish Government has made in the universal rollout of free school meals P1 to P5, maybe a lesson for other political parties right across the UK to look towards Scotland to see what we have done. And I can give a commitment to Monica Lennon and for all of those who are interested that we are absolutely committed to the rollout of universal free school meals in primary schools. And we have set out, as we have set out previously, the next phase will be to all primary 6s and 7 pupils in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. That's the next phase of that universal expansion. We're also committed to delivering the pilot, on a pilot of free universal school meals in secondary schools, and we'll continue to work closely with our delivery partners, including, of course, local authorities, on our expansion programme, which includes considering the appropriate timescales for rollout.
Monica Lennon.
The Scottish Government was leading the rest of the UK on universal free school meal rollout, but the work has stalled, First Minister, and we are falling behind. Under Nicola Sturgeon, the P6 and 7 expansion was delayed, and last year's announcement to pilot provision in secondary schools has amounted to nothing. Close working would suggest communication. I have FOI'd every local authority. There's not even been a phone call from the Scottish Government to any school or council in Scotland about this. Instead of prioritising hungry children, the Government approached COSLA at the start of this month to broker further delays. Astonishingly, councils are now being warned the full rollout in primary schools may not happen within this Parliament. Children are going hungry today and they cannot wait until 2026.
Can I have a question, please, Ms Lennon?
Will the Scottish Government keep its promise to Scotland's children? And can the First Minister guarantee that the rollout will be delivered by the end of this Parliament?
First Minister.
I would love to see the evidence for Monica Lennon's claim that we are falling behind other parts of the UK. It's simply untrue. We are leading the rest of the UK when it comes to provision of free school meals. If I look at the uptake, for example, in 2022, over 215,000 free school lunches were provided to children and young people. That's an increase from the previous high of 194,000 free lunches provided in 2016. Registrations for free school meals have reached their highest ever level as our free school meals expansion programme continues. So yes, there are challenges in relation to the rollout. We know there are challenges around, for example, the capital infrastructure that is required in order to ensure that we can progress that universal rollout. And when it comes to ensuring we tackle poverty and child poverty in particular, I would remind Monica Lennon, it is the SNP-led Scottish Government that introduced the Scottish Child Payment, and it's estimated through the actions that we have taken with this limited measure of self-government. It's estimated that will lift 90,000 children out of poverty. It is the SNP-led Scottish Government that, for example, has scrapped tuition fees, something that Labour Party have U-turned. And of course, it is now the Labour Party in the UK that have now said they will not progress with free school meal provision in the rest of the UK. So instead of chiding the Scottish Government for what they're actually doing, Monica Lennon may well want to speak to her own party and get them to follow the SNP's lead.
Thank you. I'm moving to... Actually, I'm going to take Brian Whittle. I would ask for a brief supplementary. And then we will move on to constituency and general supplementaries.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the First Minister agrees with me that if we were to offer preschool activities along with a healthy breakfast, we would be directly tackling the attainment gap, poor behaviour in class, hunger, poor mental and physical health, and that kind of intervention would be a proactive step in tackling real issues that have not been efficiently dealt with for many years.
First Minister.
Well, again, we have already made provision when it comes to children's activities. We're also, of course, committed to developing plans to deliver free breakfast to all primary and special school children as well. So we are absolutely committed to doing all of these measures and progressing them as fast as we possibly can. That is why we've increased our funding to local authorities this financial year. What makes that job remarkably more difficult is when the UK Government continues to cut our budget, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We move to constituency and general supplementaries. I call John Mason.
Thank you. I'm sure the First Minister would agree with me that it was very welcome to have Public Health Scotland's report this week saying how beneficial the minimum unit of pricing of alcohol has been and how lives have been saved. Would he be able to say anything about increasing the price from 50p perhaps to 65, or does he think the UK Government might veto that with the Internal Market Act?
First Minister.
John Mason makes a very good point. Indeed, there is simply no doubt, I think, in anyone's mind that if the Internal Market Act had been in place when we first introduced minimum unit pricing, the UK Government would have struck it down. Simply no doubt whatsoever that would have been the case. What I will say to John Mason in response to his first question is, of course, I am really pleased to see the progress that's being made through the introduction of minimum unit pricing. It is quite literally saving lives. The only tragedy is, my goodness, if we were able to have implemented that policy earlier, if it hadn't had to be dragged through the courts, how many more lives could have absolutely been saved. John Mason will be aware of the review work that is underway. It's so important, given the legal challenges that we've had previously, so important that we allow that review work to take place so that we have an absolutely robust evidence base for any decisions that are made around any increase in the minimum unit price.
Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the recent decision taken by North Lanarkshire Council to let go of 130 teachers before the summer holidays. Education chiefs emailed 80 primary and 50 secondary teachers last Friday to tell them they could no longer offer them temporary or fixed-term contracts from August. The EIS have rightly condemned this decision, as many teachers will be looking for jobs over the summer holidays. The Council have responded, saying that the Scottish Government funding for teacher recruitment has fallen substantially. In the last 2 years alone, there has been a £1.8 million reduction. First Minister, cuts to education budgets means cuts to teacher numbers. So can I ask what reassurance he can provide to the 130 teachers who will be really concerned and upset by the decision taken by North Lanarkshire Council?
First Minister.
I'm happy to correct the record if I'm wrong, of course, but I believe that council has been propped up by the Conservative Party, and Megan Gallagher may want to have a word with her Conservative colleagues about their abysmal decision to let teachers go.
Thank you.
What I would say from a Scottish Government perspective, we are, of course, increasing resources available to local government by over £793 million. That represents a real terms increase of £376 million, or indeed of 3%. Now, I would, of course, urge any local authority, regardless of whoever is in administration, to engage with schools, to engage with teachers in relation to their employment. But as I've said already to Brian Whittle, what is not helped, of course, is by our public finances, frankly, being decimated by the Westminster Government. That won't help us to fund local government one penny.
Pam Duncan-Glancy, can I just ask Mr Kerr to please resist any temptation to contribute, particularly where it's not necessarily courteous. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I draw members' attention to my register of interest as a member of Unison Scotland. Unison are outside Parliament today because the college sector is in crisis, one felt most deeply by the staff facing compulsory redundancy in the City of Glasgow College. After meeting the Principal last week, I remain deeply concerned about the cuts, but also about the process to come to the decision to make redundancies. So can I ask the First Minister, will he personally intervene and encourage more scrutiny of that decision? And will he meet union members outside Parliament today to hear directly how bad things have got for colleges, staff and students?
First Minister.
What I would say to Pam Duncan-Glancy is that I've already met with trade unions, including, for example, the UCU, who were at a roundtable discussion with me that myself and the trade unions, the STUC, co-chaired. So I have been already engaging with trade unions, and I know the situation that Pam Duncan-Glancy does describe. And, of course, the Minister for Higher Education and Further Education wrote to college principals, reminding them of the fact that, of course, while these are decisions for the colleges to take, it is so important that fair work is the guiding principle whenever it comes to these discussions. So I will receive an update from the Minister, and of course, while these are decisions for colleges to make, I will remind them again today publicly that fair work must be at the heart of every decision that they take.
Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, a recent serious fire at the abandoned Promat factory in Springburn left local communities for 2 days enduring stifling smoke and fumes, and firefighters putting their lives at risk. The fire service informed me they believe the site is a major hazard and a danger to anyone entering it, and given the scale of the site, it cannot possibly be made safe. Can I ask the First Minister that, given there may be insufficient powers to allow the local authority to effectively intervene to get the site owners to make the complex as safe as possible and ultimately clear the site, will the Scottish Government meet with me to discuss what powers may exist, or indeed, Presiding Officer, which further powers may be required in this place to take action on sites such as Promat and Springburn to better protect our communities?
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Bob Doris for raising the issue of the Promat site in Springburn, and of course I will await further details from Bob Doris, but in response to his direct question, I'm more than happy for the Scottish Government, the relevant Minister, to engage with Bob Doris to see if there's anything further we can do to address the issues that Bob Doris quite rightly raises in the Chamber.
Miles Briggs.
Officer, it's now over 9 weeks since the Edinburgh Tram inquiry was sent to the printers, more than 9 years after it was announced and 3 years since it stopped hearing evidence. It's cost Scottish taxpayers over £13 million, including the chair being paid over £1 million. Now, I know the First Minister cannot today comment on the findings of that inquiry, but can I ask the First Minister if the Scottish Government will agree to Parliament debating the inquiry findings when published in Government time, and what review will now be undertaken into the delivery of this inquiry, as it's vital that lessons are learnt for future public inquiries, and what's gone so wrong in delivering this one?
First Minister.
I would just remind Miles Briggs of the fact that, of course, this is an independent public inquiry. I am not able to interfere or intervene when it comes to the timescale of that public inquiry. I have seen the same press reports that Miles Briggs has seen, and all I would say is that when that Trams inquiry is ready to be published, there will certainly be no objection from the Scottish Government, from me as First Minister, to get that public inquiry published as soon as possible. I think it should be published as soon as it is absolutely ready for it to be published. But it is so important that when it comes to that public inquiry, that independent public inquiry, neither myself nor anybody in the Scottish Government is seen to interfere or intervene in any way whatsoever.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My constituent, Wendy, has struggled with joint pain for several years. She was finally added to the orthopaedics outpatient waiting list in June 2022. Last month, it confirmed that she was on the waiting list for a knee replacement. The wait is currently 2.5 years. This would take Wendy's overall waiting time to over 5 years. Wendy is in constant pain, and her quality of life has been seriously impacted by this. Does the First Minister think this wait time is acceptable? And can he advise what the Scottish Government are doing to achieve its legal guarantee of 12 weeks for inpatient treatment under the Patients' Right Scotland Act?
First Minister.
I can say directly to Faisal Chaudhry, the wait that he describes is not acceptable. I'm more than happy for Faisal Chaudhry to, of course, contact me to see if there's anything further that can be done in Wendy's particular case. What I would say to Faisal Chaudhry, and I know he understands this well, that there's no doubt at all that health services right across the UK, across Europe and indeed across the world, we've all been affected by the shock of the global pandemic, the biggest shock I suspect the NHS has ever faced in its nearly 75-year existence. In terms of what we are doing to make improvements in terms of waiting times, I'm more than happy to write to Faisal Chaudhry in detail about the many actions that we are taking. It's fair to say that when it comes to waits of over 2 years, in a number of cases we have made significant improvements. If I look at inpatient day cases, it's just one example. The numbers waiting longer than 2 years for inpatient day case treatment was reduced by 27% since targets were announced. In terms of outpatients, the numbers waiting over 2 years are down 19% on the last quarter. So we are making progress, but clearly in the case that Faisal Chaudhry has raised, I'm happy to look at that and see if there's anything we can do to help his constituent.
And Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the Court of Appeal's ruling this morning that the UK Government's plans to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda to make their applications while being held in detention centres are unlawful. This plan to remove some of the most vulnerable people, women and children among them, was always immoral and unjust. Today we learn it is also illegal. Does the First Minister agree that this means the Home Secretary, who has dreamt of such flights to Rwanda, must resign?
First Minister. The Parliament's standing orders provide that First Minister's question time gives members the opportunity to put questions to the First Minister on matters that fall within the responsibility of the First Minister and, of course, the responsibilities of the Government. I'm not entirely clear that question met the requirement of standing orders. And that concludes First Minister's questions. First Minister's questions is concluded. There will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and public gallery to do so before the next item begins. Can we have the Cabinet Secretary's microphone, please?
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin with a reminder of why we're discussing these matters today. The world's ecosystems are rapidly degrading. This is not a remote or an abstract problem. It's real, it's happening now, and we cannot continue to ignore what is in front of us. The marine heatwave declared in the North Sea last week, which has been labelled extreme by scientists, this clearly shows the impacts of the global climate emergency are already being felt here on our shores. It's more clear than ever that we are in the midst of a nature and climate crisis. We must be prepared to take action commensurate with the scale of that challenge, but at the same time we must do so via a fair and just transition, which empowers our people. Presiding Officer, I want to be clear why this Government believes change is required. The latest assessment under the UK Marine Strategy indicated that overall we have failed to achieve 11 out of the 15 indicators of good environmental status in our seas. Evidence presented in Scotland's 2020 Marine Assessment shows an accelerating rate of change due to human activities. 9 out of 21 marine regions in Scotland have seafloor habitats which are predicted to be in poor condition across more than half of their area. Seabirds are also in trouble, with populations of surface-feeding seabirds, such as the kittywauk, in decline. So failure to safeguard and improve the resilience of Scotland's marine ecosystems to changing climate risks, it risks the very basis on which our marine industries and coastal communities are built. The case for enhanced marine protection, therefore, is clear, and one which all parties in the Chamber agree on, or at least they did at election time. We know that where we protect our marine ecosystems, we protect and we sustain the ecosystem services that livelihoods and communities rely on, and that outcome is something that I hope we can all agree. That's why we are committed to working with coastal communities, with fishers, aquaculture, tourism and all affected sectors to enhance marine protection in Scotland for the benefit of all. There has, understandably, been considerable debate around highly protected marine areas, and I should like to thank all members, stakeholders and members of the public who have contributed so robustly to the early part of this debate. My thanks also for the many constructive conversations that I've had with MSPs from across the Chamber in recent weeks, as well as with fishing representatives, local authorities, youth representatives and environmental campaigners. That includes my colleagues in the Scottish Greens. Highly protected marine areas are part of our Butte House agreement, and I very much welcome the constructive engagement that I've had with the Green Group as we've developed our thinking on this critical issue. I have listened intently and am in no doubt of the strong views both for and against. But if there is one consistent point of consensus, it's that doing nothing is not an option. In fact, we know from a recent government-funded study that 85% of Scottish respondents consider that protecting the marine environment is important to them. So I want to emphasise that I recognise the scale of what highly protected marine areas represent. We are at the drawing board on this issue, Presiding Officer, and I have, from the very beginning of the process, invited Scotland's communities to the drawing board with us. It's why I was keen that we consulted so broadly and so early in the process as possible, with no predetermined ideas about sites. We're currently analysing the thousands of responses to that consultation, and I will, of course, give due consideration to those. A full response to the consultation and the next steps will be published after summer recess. However, I committed in this chamber to updating the Parliament on the matter as soon as I possibly could. So ahead of a fuller update after summer, I should like to share an initial one today. Now, a particular concern that has been raised with me, Presiding Officer, notably by both those who support HPMA and those who don't, is the implementation of the proposal in the proposed timeframe could risk limiting our aspirations for genuine collaboration with communities, which, to me, to this government, is absolutely integral to Scotland's approach to a fair and a just transition. Therefore, while for reasons that I have stated we firmly remain committed to the outcome of enhancing marine protection, I can confirm today that the proposal as consulted on will not be progressed. This means we will no longer seek to implement HPMAs across 10% of Scotland's seas by 2026. Over the summer, as part of ongoing dialogue with all of those who have an interest in Scotland's seas and protecting them, we will develop a new pathway and a timetable for our work. This will be in line with our draft biodiversity strategy and its ambition for Scotland to be nature positive by 2030. And it recognises that the EU has proposed marine protection in at least 10%, enhanced marine protection in at least 10% of its seas by 2030. Importantly, I will ensure that communities across Scotland are central to this process. We know that there are a plethora of innovative ideas of how we can improve protection, and this is exactly what I want to hear more of, including from those such as inshore fishermen, who recognise the importance of this to their livelihoods. It's very important to me that those affected by policies are engaged in their development. The viability of coastal and island communities matters greatly to this government. So too do matters of cultural importance that have come to the fore of this debate. As I have said a number of times, our seas must remain a source of economic and social prosperity for our nation. So I speak directly to everyone in our coastal and island communities, including those who have expressed concerns to date, when I say that I want you to help shape the future of Scotland's seas. As I, and indeed the First Minister, have said many times, communities must be meaningfully involved, and today I'm making clear that that will happen. In that regard, and on an immediate and ongoing basis, the Government does remain committed to support any group that wishes to pursue community-led marine protection in their local areas. We have already seen successful initiatives in Arran and in St Abbs and Eyemouth. I will do everything I can in this session of Parliament to support those communities who want to follow their shining examples, examples that we know can work to improve the state of the local marine environment. And while I have confirmed today that the HPMA policy as consulted upon will not be taken forward, investing in ocean health requires a range of interventions across all of our seas that we must continue to take forward as a matter of urgency. Scotland's existing marine protected area network covers approximately 37% of our seas, but individual sites must be effectively managed to achieve their objectives. And we must also do more to safeguard our particularly vulnerable species and habitats. We have an ongoing programme of work to implement fisheries management measures in existing MPAs where they are yet to be introduced, and to protect some of the most vulnerable priority marine features outside of the MPA network. These measures were delayed by Brexit, by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we're committed to putting them in place as soon as possible following due process, and I welcome the fishing industry's support in moving this forward. And I can confirm that after summer recess, we will consult on proposals for fisheries management measures in offshore MPAs beyond 12 nautical miles. The options to be consulted upon have been the subject of extensive engagement and over many years with all stakeholders. Inshore MPAs and priority marine features also require fisheries management measures. However, the complexity of the inshore and the number of sites has meant that progress has been slower than hoped. Therefore, consultation on inshore measures will take place in 2024. My colleague Mary Goujon intends to consult this summer on the potential closure of sand eel fisheries in Scottish waters. This is a crucial step in safeguarding an important food source for many species and could aid the long-term sustainability and resilience of marine ecosystems. All of that vital work, Presiding Officer, on marine protection, it must and it will proceed with pace. And of course it does so as this Government continues to support Scotland's fishing industry, not least through the £14 million Marine Fund Scotland, which the Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Goujon recently launched the third round of. And I want to take the opportunity to thank all of the stakeholders with whom Mary and I work across all these matters. Presiding Officer, I began this statement by outlining our commitment to addressing the twin crises of climate change and nature loss. Our blue economy vision recognises that our economy and society are embedded with nature. They are not external to it. It looks to move us beyond traditional narratives of choosing between ocean protection and production, recognising that the latter cannot be achieved without the former. I'll be publishing more on next steps after the summer, and of course we'll keep Parliament up to date. But I hope that what I've stated today demonstrates that I am listening, and I will continue to listen. There's been a lot of heat in the debate about HPMAs, and I hope that my commitment to develop a new pathway with all those who will join me round the table will allow a great deal less heat and more light in the matter. Because, Presiding Officer, I'm clear that both enhanced marine protection and a whole community approach is required. Presiding Officer, I said in my foreword to the recent HPMA consultation that, and I quote, "I'm determined that those who may be affected by these proposals are involved from the outset. That's why I want to hear what you think, I went on to say, I want to take on board your concerns and your ideas. Presiding Officer, while I continue my meetings across Scotland over the summer, and as my officials and I finalise analysis of the consultation responses, I trust it's clear that I'm listening and that I will continue to listen as we take forward what is the imperative of marine protection. Thank you.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. I'd be grateful if all members who wish to put a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Over the last few months, my Scottish Conservative colleagues and I have been engaging extensively with fishermen and the industry representatives across the length and the breadth of Scotland's coastal communities to hear their concerns. And never before in my role as rural spokesperson for my party have I come across a policy that is so universally opposed by an industry and by communities that industry supports. Today's statement has abjectly failed to address the concerns of our industry. Instead of listening to fishing communities, they are rehashing their plans on what the EU tells them to do. Instead of backing down, this government is doubling down on its plans to ban fishing in almost 50% of Scottish waters. Same policy, new date, Bute House fudge. Cabinet Secretary, when will the Scottish Government finally listen to the concerns of the people they are supposed to serve and drop these community-wrecking plans?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think, and I will leave it up to Rachel Hamilton, but I suspect she's going to have to correct the record at some point on some of the assertions that she has just made. It's also deeply ironic and really disappointing, actually, that she's resorting to what is politicking. And it is ironic because, as I've said a number of times now, her party, she stood on a manifesto with a commitment to highly protected marine areas. Her colleagues in the UK government are taking forward highly protected marine areas in England. And Therese Coffey, the Environment Secretary, described highly protected marine areas as a vital way forward. Now, I have been very clear from the beginning that this government believes and is utterly convinced that we must take forward enhanced marine protection in Scotland's waters, but equally we are committed to doing so via a process which communities can have faith in and which represents fairness and justice, and that's exactly what we will continue to take forward.
Thank you. Before I move to Ms Grant, can I ask that comments are... The temptation to make comments that can be audible are resisted. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this statement and I hope it is a genuine change of heart and a signal of a very different working relationship with our fishing communities. The people whose lives depend on our seas are ideally placed to make policy that protects our marine environment. Can I ask what this new engagement will look like and how it will include all those affected by changes? Can she also assure me that any changes to the management of existing marine protected areas will be carried out after full consultation with coastal communities? And will she also assure the Chamber that this is not simply HPMAs by the back door? And finally, can I ask, if communities want to instigate areas of protection, how do they do that, given the process has taken decades in the past?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Rhoda Grant mentioned the relationship between the Scottish Government and the fishing industry. And what I would say is that please do not be under any misapprehension that we have engaged on this issue in absence of others. Mary Goujon and I, our officials, we have a strong relationship with Scotland's fishing industry. We engage with them on a range of matters. We have been engaging with them on marine protection for a number of years, and I referred to that in my statement as regards to the MPA process. And I thank them for that, and I thank Scotland's marine lobby equally. I'm not going to preempt the outcome of the conversations that I'm continuing to have over the summer, nor am I going to preempt the outcome of finalised consultation responses. I remain open-minded to what this new approach to community engagement will look like. But if Rhoda Grant has ideas on how she thinks that can best be done, I would welcome them, as I would from others across the Chamber.
Alistair Allen, to be followed by Finlay Carson.
The news that the Government will not be seeking to progress the HPMA proposals represents a very welcome change of tack, which will be greeted with relief along the West Coast. Fishers have more at stake than anyone in ensuring that our seas are sustainable. So what can the Government now do to ensure that fishing communities are at the heart of future fishing policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Dr Allen is absolutely right. Our marine sectors, including the fishing industry across the whole of the country, they depend on a healthy marine environment. And of course, fishers understand how important this is, and they must have their say. I want the voices from coastal and island communities to shape their own future for their benefit. So I do, as I've mentioned, intend to establish a dialogue on the benefits of enhancing marine protection that allows that to happen. It must be a democratic process, and it must, I think, reflect the scale of the ambition of protecting Scotland's seas in the way that the nature crisis demands of us. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Dr Allen for his engagement with me on this issue, including his setting up of a very helpful meeting between me, him and the Western Isle, representatives of Western Isles Council.
Finlay Carson, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Presiding Officer, I was minded to welcome the apparent scrapping of HPMAs, but this statement is no more than a last-minute effort to pacify the rebels in our backbenches as they head off on their summer holidays, because this statement still continues to mention the unresearched arbitrary 10% target. But will the Minister apologise to our fishers and coastal communities for the worry and the distress she has caused them over the last few months? And will she join me in condemning the Green MSP Ross Greer's ridiculous attack on the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and Salmon Scotland? Or is his voice, the true voice of the Green SNP Unholy Alliance, and their misguided policies, which only outcome would be their own version of the rural islands and highland clearances?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have always, and I hope that my conduct and my contributions on this matter in the Chamber have demonstrated how seriously I take this matter. I understand both the absolute imperative of enhancing the protection of our oceans, but equally doing so in a way that is acceptable to and works for and benefits the people who live in our coastal and island communities throughout Scotland. I take that exceptionally seriously, and just, regardless of politicking from the Conservatives, I will continue to do that. And this goes to the core of the issue. We are in an emergency situation with the climate and nature degradation. And as Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, says, what that requires of us is everything, everywhere, all at once. And that is the challenge that we as a government have in Scotland. I'm dedicated to doing that, but I'm also dedicated to fairness, and I hope that what I've set out today makes that clear.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Mercedes Vial.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it's disappointing that for some members no compromise on this issue appears to be acceptable. Enhancing marine protection will safeguard invaluable marine habitats and key fish stocks, specifically by curtailing the most destructive human activities such as scallop dredging and bottom trawling. What steps will the Cabinet Secretary take to engage with communities who wish to strengthen marine biodiversity, emulate the success of the Lumlash Bay no-take zone in my constituency, and provide further protection for Scotland's inshore waters? And over what timescale will this take place?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Kenneth Gibson for his question, and also what has been a very robust support from him for proposals for enhanced marine protection, and I'll continue to liaise with him on his views on the matter. Of course, he represents an area in which we have an excellent example within Scotland of what community-led marine protection can look like. The Lamlash Bay no-take zone shows us the benefits that can be had for both the marine environment and for the people who rely on it. I was very pleased to visit Coast recently and to help launch their new Explorer vessel. They are that true example of environmental protection and community empowerment, and it's something, their example is something that I will take into the next stages of developing this process. As with my response to Rhoda Grant, I can't preempt the outcome of my consultation analysis or indeed the conversations that I'm having over summer. But I will, as I have done today, seek to update Parliament as soon as I can on the pathway forward.
Mercedes Vialba, to be followed by Emma Harper.
The status quo in Scotland's waters is not working. Last week, the Court of Session ruled that ministers unlawfully ignored the National Marine Plan when deciding on fishing licence policies. And after today's statement, it's clear that we're still no closer to a coherent marine spatial planning process. In the meantime, our waters and everyone and everything that rely on them are being squeezed. So can the Minister confirm whether the Scottish Government is committed to creating a cohesive spatial plan for our seas in this term of the Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there does appear to be a real conflict in the Scottish Labour position here, whereby Mercedes Villalba seems to reflect and remember the manifesto that she stood on that committed not to 10% HPMA, as we've consulted upon, but on double that, whereas a colleague sitting right to her left, on her left, seems to have forgotten that entirely. I mentioned in my statement the suite of other actions that we will continue to take forward, not least management measures within the MPA network, not least protection of priority marine features and our work on sand eel fishery. So I actually hope that some of the space that this statement will create in the marine protection areas will allow us to progress those matters. She mentioned the shared space and the need to manage that. We have begun in the very early days of the next National Marine Plan, and I would expect some of those matters of shared space and how best to do that will feature heavily in the development of that plan.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
I welcome this announcement, which will certainly alleviate Galloway fishers' concerns and which will be welcomed by fishing communities across Dumfries and Galloway. As the Scottish Government continues its plans to enhance marine protections for the environment, can the Cabinet Secretary reiterate how the voices of fishers, such as those in Galloway, are at the centre of these discussions? And can she confirm that she will meet with the Galloway fishers at her earliest opportunity so that their voices can be heard from the outset of any future proposals?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the genesis of what I'm saying today is that I intend to take the time to gather views from people right across Scotland about how we improve the state of our marine environment in a way that ensures that we rise to what's required of us by way of conservation, but equally in a way that serves Scotland's people. I know that there are innovative ideas out there about how we do that, and it's exactly what I want to hear more of, including from those who Emma Harper represents. I'm just finalising the meetings that I'm seeking to take forward over the summer, and I will certainly consider her approach regarding the Galloway fisher people.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. Like Alistair Allen, can I warmly welcome the Government's retreat from the arbitrary approach to HPMAs, which have caused real alarm in the island communities we represent. Of course, fishers recognise the importance of marine protection, but given that less than 10% of the existing MPA network has been monitored over the last 5 years, how does the Cabinet Secretary plan to resource the monitoring and management of MPAs? And can she say more about the way in which the engagement with island and coastal communities going forward will take place?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I would just thank Liam MacArthur for his question, although I would have to give my view that 10% is not an arbitrary figure. 10% mirrors the level of strict protection which the EU is currently seeking to develop. And I think individually, although I'll correct this if I'm wrong, I think France, Germany and Denmark are equally looking at strict protection of 10%. But look, I understand, and I think I tried to set out in my statement, that it was the coincidence of an ambitious 10% within the time frame that both those who opposed HPMAs and those who supported HPMAs were telling me that they worried limited the opportunity for the robust community engagement that I certainly want to see, and of course they do as well. So that's that and other questions about moving forward with the MPA network, as he says, is exactly what I'm taking into a dialogue over the summer, and will update Parliament on the fuller details of that once I have decided on the way forward.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Ariane Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week I met with my constituent Willie Kennedy, who's chair of the Scottish Sea Angling Conservation Network. He painted a pretty distressing picture of the decline of our inshore waters of the Clyde due to destructive trawling since the removal of the 3-mile limit in 1984, and spoke to the desire of his organisation for robust protection measures and a just transition for the Clyde fleet. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how enhanced marine protection can support the recovery of the Clyde seabed and the protection and promotion of the interests of our local communities, sea anglers and the low-impact commercial fishing sector?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Ruth Maguire for her question, and whilst I might be hearing cries of nonsense from the Tory benches, in fact it's scientific evidence from temperate locations around the world which suggests that enhanced marine protection delivers that greater conservation.
Cabinet Secretary, if you could give me a moment.
Yes.
Mr Carson, I can hear you rather too clearly, and I'd be grateful if you could allow the Cabinet Secretary to respond.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was going to briefly go on to say that it can lead to a wider range of seafloor species, larger populations and increased resilience to disturbance. And we have studies which show this from around the world, including in California and in New Zealand, and in particular the benefits of spillover from highly protected areas, where of course greater species abundance in and around highly protected marine areas is quite clearly advantageous to those who make their living from the seas. And I've mentioned studies such as Lamlash Bay, but they have shown that those commercially important species such as the king scallop and the lobster are more numerous, they are older and they are larger following protection. So if I can have one message from today's update, it is that the position, as was consulted on, is now no longer being progressed, but this government goes into our conversation about the process with a very clear principle that enhanced marine protection is required and will be implemented.
Ariane Burgess, to be followed by Edward Mountain.
I welcome the constructive approach being taken to protecting our marine environment and fish stocks for current and future generations. The new time frame will allow genuine partnership working with communities to deliver enhanced protection and help us align with the EU. In the meantime, community-led marine reserves, as we've been hearing already today, like Lamlash Bay, could lead the way. What will the Cabinet Secretary do to encourage more coastal communities to come forward and ensure that all voices are heard, such as those working in tourism, conservation and young people, as well as all parts of the fishing industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Ariane Burgess for her question and indeed her engagement with me on the matter. I think that she's touched on a point about how willing communities feel able to come forward. I said that I thought there had been more heat than light in this debate. I think that there has been. There's a toxicity which has surrounded it, and I hope that today I'm creating the breathing space for us all to come back round the table, everybody who's interested to come back round the table and to find a way forward. And my point regarding encouraging communities to come forward is that I do think, amid the toxicity, there was a reluctance amongst those who probably supported HPMAs or would like to see one in their communities. They maybe didn't feel that they could come forward. So I want to take the heat out of this debate. I want to involve everybody with an interest, and I will encourage and support any community that wants to follow the Lamlash example and seek to develop this locally.
Edward Mountain, to be followed by Karen Adam.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to remind the Chamber of my register of interest that I am a joint proprietor of an inshore fishery for migratory fish. This statement today is partially about protection. It's also a huge amount about deflection, political deflection, because only this morning I was told and reminded that this HPMA process has created confusion and anger across all coastal communities, a lack of transparency and accountability, which featured as part of the recent Court of Session ruling on inshore fisheries and fishing licences. My question to the Cabinet Secretary is simple. The REC Committee in 2018, recommendation 53, recommended moving salmon farms from inshore areas to further out to sea to ensure that they did less damage to the coast. Will she ensure that that is part of the process and she doesn't forget that when she's taking this process forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, political deflection is all we get from the Conservatives, I'm afraid. But to come on to the point that Edward Mountain raises, firstly, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and I are taking forward work on some of the points he raises and the aquaculture generally through our Scottish Aquaculture Council, which is proving to be an excellent forum to discuss and to exchange many ideas and proposals around the sustainable future of aquaculture for Scotland. We'll continue to do that. And equally, This is a process that I want to bring everyone round the table on. That includes Edward Mountain, it includes MSPs from across the chamber. So if he does have ideas about changes to the aquaculture industry in Scotland, he is always welcome to bring them to me, to Mary Goujon, or indeed to be part of the dialogue on the future of HMPAs.
Karen Adam, to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnston.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for her constructive dialogue that we've had and for taking the time to listen to the concerns of the coastal communities and the fishers which I represent. Fishers are well aware of the need to safeguard the health of our seas because not just do they rely on that for their livelihoods, but also our food security. They bring intergenerational knowledge and experience to the table. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how fishers will be able to feed this wealth of knowledge into any future discussions on enhancing marine protections as we continue to protect our marine environment along with our world-renowned vital food source?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Karen Adam for the question. Co-management is at the heart of how we manage fisheries in Scotland, and it will be, as I hope I've made clear today, part of how we take forward a pathway on enhanced marine protection. Equally, that fishermen can feed into discussions through established forums on the generality of marine matters in Scotland, including through the Fisheries Management and Conservation Group. I mentioned previously, in a previous answer, that the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and I and our officials, we work with the fishing industry regularly. The Scottish Government has done so for years on quota, on financial support, indeed emotional support in difficult times, and on marine protection through the MPA network. And interestingly, one of the things that's been raised with me in this process is that there is a great deal of faith in the MPA process and the means by which management measures are taken forward through that. So we are ever learning. This is an iterative process. That's what we're facing as we try to live up to what the climate and nature emergency demands of us.
And Jamie Halcrow-Johnston.
In claiming to take her plans back to the drawing board, the Cabinet Secretary now says there will be dialogue with marine stakeholders and that communities will be central to that process. Presiding Officer, I'm at a loss to know why that wasn't the approach from the very start of this. But the Cabinet Secretary said that HPMAs was part of the Butte House Agreement, and so will she be honest with this chamber? Is this a genuine U-turn from the Scottish Government, albeit one forced by anger in local communities, opposition from across this chamber, and the threat of rebellion in the SNP backbenches? Well, given the Greens seem to be happy with this new approach, is this just a sleight of hand? And Scotland's coastal communities and our fishing communities still have a lot to be worried about this SNP Green Government's intentions.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this is not as is characterised by Jamie Halcrow-Johnston, because I have been clear from the start that I always understood the ambition that was represented in our proposals. That's why the Government was clear from the beginning that we wanted to hear views, we wanted to have Scotland's communities, industry, local authorities help us shape the process by which we deliver enhanced marine protection. And I'm glad that Jamie Halcrow-Johnston has given me the opportunity to demonstrate just how much engagement has already been part of the development of this process, not least that early and broad consultation. But we held some 20 meetings with stakeholders.
Cabinet Secretary, Mr Halcrow-Johnston, you have put your question. I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could respond.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Some 20 meetings with key stakeholders in advance of consulting to take their views on what could be involved. We held meetings during the consultation, principally to assist anybody who wanted to complete it to do so. Since closing, I have discussed matters in Troon with fishing representatives. I have discussed matters with the Western Isles Council representatives. I've met the community of Coast in Arran. I have spoken with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. I have met with Environment Link. And I've met with representatives of the Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust. I will continue to engage with the spectrum of interests in this matter as we deliver the imperative of marine protection.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business.
And the next item of business is a statement by Neil Gray on leading Scotland's journey to becoming a start-up nation. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement. Therefore, there should be no interventions or interruptions. I would invite Cabinet Secretary around 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am convinced that high-growth entrepreneurship can power the transformation of the Scottish economy. The economic impact of new and scaling firms is colossal. They are 40% more productive than the economy as a whole, act as a magnet for external investment and radiate innovation through customers and supply chains, driving job creation and wage growth beyond the walls of their own enterprises. And in Scotland, the true value of our start-up community goes beyond what can be measured by hard economic analysis. Our entrepreneurs are people of vision, drive and imagination, and through the problems they solve and the jobs they create, they use these gifts to make better futures for our people and our communities. I think of Blackford Analysis, which uses the power of artificial intelligence to improve patient outcomes. I think of Rusa, a Google-backed seafood trading platform that protects our waters by eliminating waste and empowers local fishermen to command the best price for their catch. I think of Intelligent Growth Solutions, a rapidly scaling firm whose approach to precision farming is at the frontier of the push to deliver global food security. These companies and dozens more dispel the myth that growth and well-being are contradictory economic principles. Presiding Officer, it is for all of these reasons that this Government is today setting a vision to establish Scotland as one of Europe's leading start-up economies. We begin this journey from a position of strength. Despite significant macroeconomic headwinds, our start-up ecosystem last year attracted record investment of £953 million, outperforming all UK regions with the exception of the so-called Golden Triangle between London, Oxford and Cambridge. But our pride at this success must be tempered by the reality that over this same period, the Swedish ecosystem attracted capital totalling £5.4 billion. This illustrates the scale of the prize and underscores that the gap between Scotland's entrepreneurial potential and its performance is perhaps our greatest economic opportunity. What we needed was a plan to help us realise that potential, and that is why we appointed Mark Logan as Scotland's first Chief Entrepreneur. We have worked closely with him, producing a series of publications that together form a sophisticated and comprehensive plan to drive the systematic reforms necessary to establish Scotland as a world-class entrepreneurial economy. This new plan proposes actions across the strategic domains of gender equality, infrastructure, education and international presence. I'll now proceed to take each of these in turn, describing our achievements today and our priorities in the current financial year. I'll begin with the Scottish Government's response to Pathways, Anna Stewart and Mark Logan's groundbreaking review of how we can support more women to start and scale businesses. And I'd like to thank Anna and Mark for their work and recent engagement, which has helped to persuade me of the need to drive so hard on this agenda. The Pathways review findings are stark and its recommendations are bold. Only 1 in 5 of Scotland's businesses are led by women. Start-ups founded by women receive only 2% of investment capital. And the lack of meaningful progress is explained by deep-rooted societal barriers that disproportionately impact women. The review correctly describes this as a denial of opportunity on literally an industrial scale. This is intolerable in the well-being economy that I am dedicated to building. We have a moral and economic duty to meet these challenges head-on, and that is why I am proud to announce that we are accepting this report and will immediately work on its implementation. The report's recommendations are broad and powerful, encompassing cultural change, long-term intervention in education and more immediate support to women in business. I will therefore focus my remarks on the actions that we will prioritise in this financial year. First, we are committed to the creation of pre-start centres and pop-ups, focused on encouraging women to start businesses and providing best-in-class support to help them develop products, adopt sound commercial strategies and get early access to funding. As part of that work, we will give early consideration to how we can implement the proposal for a concept fund, offering women the seed funding they need to turn good ideas into growing businesses. Second, we will relaunch the Scottish Government's Competitive Ecosystem Fund with an explicit focus on supporting projects and address the review's key themes of entrepreneurial technique, access to finance and education. I'm also pleased to announce that we will maintain our support for the organisations such as Women's Enterprise Scotland, Investing Women and Business Women Scotland ahead of a shift to competitive funding in future years. Third, we will work with our enterprise agencies, the Scottish National Investment Bank and private sector investors to open up investment avenues for women-led businesses and for other underinvested groups. And finally, we will improve our collection and reporting of data, developing a dashboard of measures to evaluate the extent to which our actions are succeeding. Moving on to entrepreneurial infrastructure, the Scottish Government is well on its way to delivering arguably the finest system in Europe dedicated to the creation and scaling of high-growth businesses. The £42 million tech scaler network is a game-changer for our start-up community, putting the wind of Silicon Valley technique into the sails of Scottish innovation. This is a complex project, delivered on time, on budget, and 6 of the 7 physical sites are fully operational and already host 247 start-ups, with a further 1,300 members accessing virtual support and education the length and breadth of Scotland. An end-to-end entrepreneurial curriculum has been developed, with courses ranging from beginner level through to the advanced techniques necessary to achieve scale. Reforge is Silicon Valley's most prestigious provider of scale-up education, and through TechScaler, Scotland is the only country in the world to hold a national licence, with 47 entrepreneurs already learning and growing alongside the world's best businesses. A key objective is to ensure that the services offered by pre-start centres and existing ecosystem assets, such as NHS testbeds and the Net Zero Technology Centre, are seamlessly connected to the TechScaler network, creating a powerful continuum of support for entrepreneurs in every industry as they progress through each level of scale. And as part of ensuring that our existing ecosystem continues to flourish, I can confirm that we will once again support Scottish Edge's excellent complementary work to identify and back Scotland's most promising new businesses. And just this Tuesday, in a speech to ecosystem builders in Brussels, the First Minister announced the publication of Ross Tuffey and Joe Little's report on entrepreneurial campuses, the Scottish Government's blueprint to position our universities and colleges as hotbeds of start-up creation and scaling. This work is about establishing an alliance with universities and colleges, catalysing a movement that has already started to build in the sector through an increased focus on spin-out companies and the broader commercialisation of research. This movement is responsive to a shifting culture in which learners no longer view institutions merely as a means of acquiring a degree, but as places where they can meet co-founders, experiment with cutting-edge technologies and create the innovation-led businesses necessary to drive Scotland's economic future. The report sets out a range of initiatives to accelerate that mission, and we have provided £5.5 million increase in the 23-24 University Innovation Fund to deliver it. Presiding Officer, I now turn to entrepreneurial culture and education. I take my hat off to our wonderful entrepreneurs and to the work that they do. And while there appears to be a perception that entrepreneurs must somehow be different, the evidence suggests, and repeated studies have shown, that consistent exposure to quality entrepreneurial education and networks is a powerful means of instilling the necessary mindset, attitudes and skills. In other words, we can train our entrepreneurs. That is why I am pleased to announce that over the coming year, I will work closely with ministerial colleagues, our partners at Young Enterprise Scotland, the Prince's Trust, industry and, crucially, our teachers to systematically embed project-based entrepreneurial learning in schools across Scotland, alongside other measures we are working on for our schools. As the flywheel effect of our interventions across infrastructure, education and investment start to yield momentum, we will also have an eye to what that means for Scotland's presence on the global stage. The best entrepreneurial ecosystems are synonymous with the nations that host them, acting as a magnet for talent and inward investment. Our ambition is therefore to establish Scotland as a global hub for start-up founders and investors, akin to the reputation presently enjoyed by Sweden and Finland. Recent events to showcase Scottish business in Helsinki, Silicon Valley and New York revealed strong interest from external investors in the quality of Scottish start-ups, an impression that we are keen to reinforce. And so we will this year embark on an exciting pilot to establish a branch of the TechScaler network in the heart of Silicon Valley. This will allow the stars of the Scottish start-up scene to live and work for an extended period in the world's leading hub for innovation, exposing founders to expanded networks world-class technique and enhanced opportunities to raise capital. As well as being hugely enriching an experience for the founders, the idea is that the quality of our companies will stimulate broader investor interest in the Scottish ecosystem. And as that interest takes hold, over time, we will look to build links with other leading ecosystems, such as the Nordics, Canada and Ireland, bringing new ideas, talent and investment to Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, in perhaps the most challenging fiscal environment in living memory, this package of support represents an investment in our start-up ecosystem of up to £17.5 million this financial year. It is a package of vision and aspiration that sends a clear and powerful message to Scotland's innovators, entrepreneurs and disruptors. This government believes in you and we are prepared to back you. And I will close by reminding the Chamber that it was a Scottish start-up led by James Watt that ignited the industrial revolution that transformed global living standards and lifted millions of people across the world out of poverty. With the health and demographic challenges post-pandemic, with the cost of living crisis, with climate change and the economic damage caused by Brexit, the challenges that we face today are no less profound. The world needs Scottish start-ups to get to work, and we will help them on their way. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes, after which we'll need to move on to the next item of business, and I'll be grateful for any members wishing to ask a question to press the request to speak buttons. And I call first Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and for advance sight of it? And can I welcome the focus that he puts upon promoting entrepreneurship and the new initiatives being announced today. These are much needed. This government has had a troubled relationship with the business community, not helped by the fact that the junior coalition partners are actively hostile to economic growth. And our track record on business start-ups is poor. In 2019, the last year before COVID, Scotland had 48 new business registrations per 10,000 of the adult population, compared to a UK average of 72. And excluding London, the UK figure is 62. So even on that basis, we are lagging far behind other parts of the UK. So in welcoming the announcements today, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary the following? Firstly, does he have a target for increasing the business start-up rate for Scotland? If so, what is it, and for when will it be delivered? Secondly, in relation to the serious issue he raised of the lack of start-up capital for women entrepreneurs, when does he expect the initiatives he announced today to be delivered? And thirdly, in relation to entrepreneurial learning in schools, does he intend that this will be mainstreamed across the curriculum and taught to all pupils, or is it the intention is that this be an optional standalone subject?
The Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Murdo Fraser for the constructive way in which he has responded to the statement and our statement of intent around making Scotland the start-up hub of Europe. He thanked me for advance sight, some of the statements, some of which we discussed last night with Daniel Johnson as well at the RBS dinner, that we were discussing some elements of the issues that are before us, including access to finance, which I recognise as a major challenge for some of those who are looking to get access to start-up. That's exactly why we're looking to instil the confidence in the market to ensure that access to finance can continue to come. I've mentioned in my statement the fact that we've already seen a record investment in Scottish start-ups coming over the last year. We want to build on that. That's not enough, and we heard last night evidence of where there are challenges. I'll keep working with financial colleagues and with the business community to see what more we can do to ensure that access to finance can continue to flow. I don't have a particular target. I'm happy to talk to Murdo Fraser about where we might see this ending up. But I think we have seen, not least in what Murdo Fraser highlighted in his contribution, where we have room for growth. And we certainly have room for growth. And in terms of the work being done in schools, I'll be working with my colleague Jenny Gilruth and education colleagues around how much further we can go in terms of ensuring that there is access to this type of education within our school environment.
Daniel Johnson to be followed by Ivan McKee.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for advanced sight. And can I welcome this focus? Because undoubtedly I agree with him that start-ups are a potential to drive new jobs and growth for the Scottish economy. And I also welcome the reintroduction of the Scottish Edge funding. I know that that interruption actually led to a reduction in the number of awards they were able to make this year, so that is welcome. But can I engage in something of critical consensus? Because I agree, while there are strengths, there are issues in terms of Scottish start-ups, and indeed in terms of the total number of start-ups. The only English region Scotland beat was the North East. We lack high-growth firms. We have 1.5 high-growth firms for 10,000 people compared to 3. And indeed, my stat from last night that is ringing in my ears is that 40% of Scottish businesses have never accessed any formal finance at all. So can I ask the questions? Following on from the point about targets, the Cabinet Secretary said there would be a scorecard. When will we have that scorecard, and what metrics will it contain? Indeed, will it have a broad spectrum rather than just high-tech, high-growth start-ups? On the point around growth in small and micro businesses, we know many businesses start but then stall. So what initiatives will there be to help investment and growth amongst the broad base of small and micro businesses?
Cabinet Secretary,
Can we make sure that there's no over-focus on particular
Mr Johnson,
sectors?
can you resume your seat? Cabinet Secretary.
I'm happy to have a further discussion with Daniel Johnson to answer some of these points in more detail and to get to some of the questions that he was perhaps looking to get to. But in his questions, he diagnoses exactly why we need to take this intervention. You know, he's absolutely right in terms of the statistics that he and I saw last night from RBS, in terms of the work that is still needing to be done in terms of access to finance, in terms of encouraging greater numbers of start-ups. So I'm happy to engage with Mr Johnson over the summer months on answering some of the questions that he poses.
Ivan McKee to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for the statement, and hugely encouraged by the amount of work that's going into taking forward this entrepreneurial agenda. It's worth noting that Scotland's business start-up rate for young people is actually amongst the highest in the UK, thanks to the good work of Young Enterprise Scotland, Prince's Trust, Converse Challenge and others. So can I ask what the Scottish Government are doing to build on this good work, making starting a business be seen as a genuinely aspirational career choice and positive destination for young people, including information and support for young people thinking of becoming entrepreneurs?
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, can I pay tribute to Ivan McKee and Kate Forbes for starting this work that I am now able to build upon, to ensure that we have the foundations of the support network, to ensure that we not only have the infrastructure that allows for people to be able to start their own business, but there is an encouragement from an early age to be able to do that. And he's absolutely right in terms of the work being done with the likes of Young Enterprise Scotland. I remember I was involved in Young Enterprise when I was at school myself, a wonderful initiative that is done alongside the Prince's Trust as well. In addition to that, ensuring that young people are exposed as early as possible to that type of mindset. But also, I point Ivan McKee to the announcement made this week by the First Minister around entrepreneurial campuses. I think that is going to make a transformational change.
Liz Smith to be followed by Rona McCarthy.
Can I also welcome what the Cabinet Secretary has said, but can I ask him if he also agrees that this is only going to be deliverable if there is a broader perspective on economic policy which enhances productivity, economic growth and which reduces the tax burden for businesses?
Cabinet Secretary.
So Liz Smith and I had a very interesting discussion this morning around some of these issues. I'm looking to foster a wellbeing economy in Scotland where we recognise that there cannot be a good, strong economy without a good society. There cannot be a good society without a strong economy, and the two need to work together. We're looking alongside the work that has been published this morning on realigning and our relationship with business and also making sure that we deliver upon some of the points that have been raised there. We need to make sure that we have economic growth, but that economic growth is for a purpose, and that purpose is about making sure that we deliver on the well-being of our people as well as our businesses across Scotland.
Rona McCarthy to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for such a positive statement? I'm particularly delighted to hear of the start-up initiatives for women.
However, start-ups will be facing additional financial pressures given the current challenges our economy faces. So can the Cabinet Secretary provide any information as to the steps which the Scottish Government can take to mitigate these pressures?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, thank Rona Mackay for that. Obviously, we're acutely aware of the challenges the operating environment that businesses continue to face in the wake of Brexit, recovering from COVID, the current conflict, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the resulting cost impacts. The Scottish Government is well connected into the start-up ecosystem and is in constant dialogue to understand the pressures that start-ups are facing, as well as the opportunities that we must capitalise on at pace. We appreciate that start-ups are operating in a complex economic environment, but that's why our £42 million national network of tech scalers is committed to providing founders and leaders in terms of the necessary skills on funding models, investor attraction and pitching. Alongside other initiatives, including enterprise agency support, we're committed to fostering an environment which access to funding is seamless despite economic pressures.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
Presiding Officer, can I apologise to the Chamber? I can't wait to the very end of the statement today. The universities are at the forefront of innovation, medical sciences and renewables, but despite that success, people working within the city of Glasgow have expressed to me concerns that their expertise has not been converted into jobs growth on the scale that it should. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what plans are there for the Scottish Government to capitalise on the skills and innovation being developed in Glasgow universities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely. This speaks to what I just referred to in answer to Ivan McKee around entrepreneurial campuses, making sure that we have continue to enjoy the benefits of university spin-offs, but also the recently published innovation strategy around ensuring that we have a really strong economic performance in terms of the incredible work that has been done by our researchers and academics at universities, including those in Glasgow.
Audrey Nicholl, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. Like other colleagues, I greatly welcome this statement and its relevance to the energy sector. The North East-based Net Zero Technology Centre's TechX programme has to date supported almost 60 start-ups successfully accelerated, 8 technologies commercialised, over 200 employees hired and at least £88 million in start-up equity funding raised. So given the significant success of the TechX Accelerator programme, will the Cabinet Secretary support having an enhanced clean energy technology acceleration programme such as TechX Accelerator as part of an energy transition cluster in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm certainly happy to meet Audrey Nicholl to discuss that potential, because I recognise the enormous economic and entrepreneurial potential of Scotland's expertise in net zero technologies, paired with the abundance of our natural resources. So supporting the growth of this sector is a priority for this government, and businesses seeking to start up, grow and scale in this field will be supported through our entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I look forward to hearing more about Audrey Nicholl's proposals.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Stephanie Callaghan.
This is an eminently sensible proposal, but the Minister will understand for years this has been as much about a cultural change as it is about a system change. But I do welcome the proposals, particularly for women, and making sure we tap into that potential. Universities are going to be important to make this a success. So is he sure we've got the right balance of freeing up intellectual property? And secondly, how is he going to reverse the decline in the performance of Scottish university research compared with the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think, first of all, Willie Rennie is absolutely right in terms of the cultural change. That's what I've set out in my statement in terms of ensuring that we work with the financial centres and others, our agencies, to ensure that there is that mindset shift and a cultural change to support a greater diversity in our start-up ecosystem. In terms of universities, I've set out in response to Pauline McNeill and indeed to Ivan McKee around pointing him towards the entrepreneurial campus model, but I'm more than happy to have a discussion with him further on the areas that he raises.
Stephanie Callaghan, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Presiding Officer, social enterprises are key to creating the inclusive, empowered communities and the fair and more equal society we often speak of. And the 2021 Social Enterprise Census recorded a £2.63 billion contribution to the Scottish economy. So does the Minister agree that social enterprises will be key to that innovation that lies at the core of solving many of Scotland's societal changes that he touched on in his statement earlier? And what role does he see the social enterprise model playing in supporting Scotland's journey to become a start-up nation?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, the Scottish Government's long-term vision of social enterprise is to be at the forefront of ethical and socially responsible business in Scotland, far-reaching and becoming central to the way that Scotland chooses to do business. Social enterprises in Scotland are supported through a world-class system of support. This includes a pipeline of social investment into the sector from pre-start-up through to loans for growth-ready business, as well as innovative funding for those in between. Last year, through Scottish Government investment, we funded the start-up of nearly 100 social enterprises, and in addition to this, a range of business support for the social enterprise sector continues to be provided.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. He will be familiar with the need for successful start-ups to consider both scaling up and scaling deep, as we've heard from Professor Logan. And following on from the previous question, he will also be aware of the value and social good that cooperatives provide, building community cohesion and resilience, placemaking, creating and sustaining social capital, community wealth and more. They do, by their nature, like social enterprises, scale deep. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how this business model, specifically cooperatives, will be supported by this positive vision for the benefit of local people and community economies across Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I thank Maggie Chapman for that question. She's absolutely right in terms of the scaling up and scaling deep that alternative business models such as cooperatives, and I declare an interest as a member of a cooperative myself, can deliver. We'll continue to provide support to cooperatives in Scotland, and I'll write to Maggie Chapman to provide more detail on the support that's been provided.
Jamie Halker-Johnson, to be followed by Stewart McMillan.
Thank you. My colleagues Murdo Fraser and Liz Smith have already highlighted that the number of start-ups in Scotland lags behind those in England, which concerns that Scotland's tax policy is one area which impacts on this. I'm sure nearly all in this chamber will agree that it's vitally important that we foster a pro-business environment in Scotland to ensure start-ups have the best possibility of success. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government will ensure that entrepreneurial interests are being considered right across all relevant policy areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Jamie Halker-Johnson for his question. I would challenge slightly his assertion around our tax policy putting off investment in Scotland, because, of course, Scotland is outperforming the rest of the UK in terms of inward investment. So that doesn't quite match up. But I accept. But obviously I accept that we want to ensure that having the best place to do business in Scotland was part of the theme of the New Deal for Business Group, and ensuring that we continue to talk about the package of support that is on offer, some of which I was talking to Liz Smith about this morning. Is my job to sell Scotland as being a good place to do business. I will continue to do so and ensure that, as he suggests, I continue to listen to entrepreneurs in the work that they're doing, not least our Chief Entrepreneur, Mark Logan, behind which we base our plans.
Stewart McMillan, to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's no doubting that entrepreneurship can better be driven by tapping into the most diverse talent group possible. So can the Cabinet Secretary advise what steps the Scottish Government has taken to break down social and economic barriers to entrepreneurship and to support diversity in start-ups and business?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, absolutely. As the Pathways report sets out, unlocking Scotland's full entrepreneurial potential offers a huge opportunity economically. As we fully develop the delivery plans to implement Pathways recommendations, will widen access to entrepreneurial support and education across all underrepresented groups, and delivering accessible support where it is needed, when it is needed. There is no doubt, I've said this previously in the chamber before, that unlocking the economic potential of women, ensuring that we close the gender pay gap and close the employment gap, ensure that we close the gap on female start-ups, has one of the greatest economic potentials we can invest in.
And Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scotland has always been an innovative entrepreneurial country, including in start-ups. But the gap actually, I think, lies in what happens next in that early growth. And previously, the SEIS and EIS schemes have been a vehicle in which public sector and private sector have been able to work together to invest in early-stage companies, giving them that step up. So can I ask the Scottish Government what it will do to encourage private investment in early-stage business growth, including tax-efficient use of funding from investment houses and high-net-worth investors?
Yes, this is part of the challenge that we heard last night in terms of where the private investment comes from. A lot of that does come internationally rather than domestically. But I would also point to the support that we are looking to provide our entrepreneurs and our start-ups with the investment in the TechScaler network, and ensuring that that is married and matched to the likes of the NHS test beds to give better certainty to the projects that they're working on from an investment perspective. I'm more than happy to provide more detail of that to Brian Whittle, so that gives some confidence as to the work that we're doing.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes this item of business. The next item of business is consideration of motion 9765 in the name of Marie Todd on the Online Safety Bill UK legislation, and I call Ginny Mental to move the motion. Thank you. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move motions 9821 on committee membership and 9822 on substitution in committees. Minister.
Both moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question on these motions will be put at decision time. There are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 9765 in the name of Marie Todd on Online Safety Bill UK legislation be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I propose to ask a single question on two Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does any member object? Thank you. The final question is that motions 9821 on committee membership, 9822 on substitution on committees in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed, and that concludes decision time. We'll now move on to members' business. We'll have a brief pause actually to allow members to leave the chamber, but please do so as quickly and as quietly as possible.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.